Homang, Charlie Smith, Jongbanji, Georgia Strait. I'm the editor of the Georgia Strait newspaper in Vancouver, and we're happy to be back for another week on WOW TV. One of the stories that we broke in our paper this week was two SFU students have put up a website, and what they're doing is seeking comments from the public about harassment they've experienced on the transit system. So the two young students, what they wanted to do was to gather stories for a school project, and it was called Harassment on TransLink, their website. Well, what's happened is a whole bunch of people have come forward, women in particular, talking about some of the experiences they've had, and it's been quite horrific, actually. The amount of sexual abuse and problems of that nature when they're riding the buses and the SkyTrain. So now what's happened is the transit police, their spokesperson Ann Drennan has announced that there will be a campaign by the transit police against harassment on the transit system. So we're watching for that to roll out. It could roll out by December, and in the meantime, many people are going to this website and writing their comments about what happened to them on the transit system. One of the stories that I did in the Georgia Strait today, it related to the Vancouver Writers' Fest. And this is an annual event that's been taking place for many years where writers come in from around the world. One of the writers is actually the winner of the Booker Prize is on the lineup. So they get top writers. Well, the person I interviewed was Alan Wiseman, who's author of a book called Countdown, and it looks at the rising global population. His previous book, which was translated into more than 30 languages, was called The World Without Us, and it looked at what would happen to the natural world as humans disappeared. Well, this new book, Countdown, is actually the opposite, and it's looking at what's happening in terms of the rising population. So he visited numerous countries. He went to Japan, where the population is dropping, and there's an aging population, and he found in some respects they were doing quite well, but you see nature coming back. He went to China, where there was a lot of discussion about the one-child policy that was introduced in 1979. And it's his view, a lot of people in China, they're kind of tired of the one-child policy, but they also recognize that it was a great success in curbing population growth and preventing famine and starvation and helping the country get on its feet economically. He went to Pakistan, which he said was one of the worst areas that he's ever seen in terms of how the population is completely out of control because of a weak central government, a lot of religious fundamentalism. But what's happened recently, which is quite interesting, is the rise of the young educational activist Malala, who was nominated for a Nobel Prize, and she's calling for education for girls. Well, this is something that Alan Wiseman has found is related to reducing population. The more education you have for young women, girls and young women, there's a correlation between that and reducing the number of children they have. And this is one of the things that happened in China, that there's a great amount of equality between men and women in China. Well, in Pakistan, there isn't, but Malala is trying to do this. But in another country nearby, Iran, they actually reduced the population, or they didn't reduce it, but they reduced the increase in the population with some measures involving increased education for women. And this occurred under a heavily religious government of Ayatollah Khomeini. It's kind of a theocracy in Iran. You've got the elected government, but then you have this kind of parallel power rested with the religious authorities. So basically what happened there was during the Iran-Iraq war, they were trying to increase the population and urging the Iranians to reproduce. But what they found was they had so many young people, and there were great concerns that the economy wouldn't be able to absorb them. So after the war, they brought in a bunch of measures to promote contraception, even allow people to get sterilized if they wanted to. It was all voluntary, and it was very successful. But what Alan Wiseman has pointed out in his book is more recently, as there's been threats of war with Iran, that the government is backing away from that policy. He also went to the Philippines, which has had enormous population growth. And it's crossed over 100 million now living in the Philippines. The problem in the Philippines is 90% of the protein consumption comes from the sea. And when you have such a large population in the Philippines, what you're seeing is that they're running out of fish, and the fishermen are having trouble making a living. So they've been putting pressure on the government. What happened is the President Benigno Aquino brought in legislation to allow for family planning and allow contraception. But the Roman Catholic Church is very upset about this, and that legislation's being challenged in the court. Another place Alan Weisman went to was Africa. So he went to Uganda, where he saw the problem was the growing population is posing a threat to other primates, like gorillas in particular. And in Niger, which is a country in West Africa, that has the women there have an average of 8 to 9 children. So it's just population growth out of control. Nearby Nigeria, that's the fastest growing country in the world, its population is expected to double to 344 million by 2040. So the world's population is about 7 billion as of 2011. At the current increase, it's going to be 10.9 billion by 2100. So these are some of the facts that Alan Weisman is writing about, and he's worried, are we going to be able to sustain humanity with population growth of that magnitude, and are we going to be seeing more famine? So he was looking at how different countries have dealt with it, and in some Catholic countries, even though the Roman Catholic Church opposes contraception, in places like Spain and Italy, the education of women is one of the reasons why the population has been kept quite stable. So it's a major issue. And another story that we had in the Georgia Strait, which is on a happier note, was there was quite a momentous event in Vancouver this week. A man named Bob McDonald rode a bicycle across Canada, which is, quite impressive, but add this. The man is legally blind. So he rode across Canada from Nova Scotia to British Columbia legally blind. Well, what he did was it was because he had a tandem bicycle with his friend. Bob McDonald rode across the country and with his friend and arrived in Vancouver, and it was to raise funds for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, also for Canadian guide dogs, and for the YMCAs. And he said it was tough, especially in Northern Ontario and getting through Rogers Pass, but he achieved his dream. And so, Rick Hansen was the first person to wheel across the country in a wheelchair. Bob McDonald from Truro, Nova Scotia, Pictou, Nova Scotia, is the first person to ride a bicycle across Canada, legally blind.